Picture this: a newborn child, minutes old, torn from its mother's trembling arms and carried into the hands of men who have forgotten tenderness. They strip the baby naked. The lamplight glints off their wrinkled faces as they turn it over, checking every joint, every limb, every line along the spine. They are not midwives, they are judges, and their verdict decides whether the child will live or die. This is not myth. This was policy. This was Sparta. We remember Sparta for its soldiers, the 300 who stood at Thermopylae, the men of iron who fought without fear, who defined courage for millennia. But we forget how those warriors were made. Their legend began not in battlefields, but in bedrooms, in breeding chambers dictated by the state, where the human body was engineered, not born, for war. The Spartan war machine didn't begin with spears or shields. It began with selection. Every aspect of life was controlled: who married, who conceived, who lived, who died. The city-state operated like a living laboratory, a social experiment designed to breed out weakness and produce the ultimate instrument of war. If you want to build a perfect weapon, you don't start with a soldier. You start before birth. You control the bloodline. You decide which bodies deserve to exist. You sever the human bonds that might interfere with absolute loyalty to the state. For 3 centuries, Sparta succeeded, creating a population of warriors so disciplined, so terrifying, that the ancient world whispered their name with reverence and fear. But the price was unbearable. To forge these perfect warriors, Sparta first had to destroy what it meant to be human. Imagine you a young Spartan man, barely 20. You've never chosen anything in your life. Not your friends, not your education, not even your name. Now you will not choose your wife either. That decision has already been made in a room you'll never enter by men whose faces you might never see. The Gerousia, the Council of Elders, and the ephors who rule beneath them. They've been watching you since childhood. They know your bloodline, your father's record in war, your grandfather's endurance, your mother's fertility. They study you the way breeders study livestock. A good back means endurance. Broad shoulders mean potential. For women, wide hips mean easier childbirth. A straight posture, health. The state doesn't speak of beauty or love. It speaks of genetics, centuries before the word even existed. When the council decides, you're informed, not consulted. Your marriage is arranged like a treaty between 2 farms. And the wedding night? A ritual of cold efficiency disguised as tradition. The ceremony begins with abduction. The groom seizes the bride, as if by force. She's taken to a dark room, her head shaved, her body dressed in men's clothes. He sneaks from the barracks at night, consummates the marriage in near darkness, and leaves before dawn. There are no whispered words, no shared smiles, only function. A brief act of state service disguised as intimacy. Why this strange ritual? Because Sparta understood something that most societies feared to admit. Love is a competing loyalty. A man who loves his wife might hesitate to die for his city. But a man whose wife is a stranger, a partner chosen by decree, will march into death without hesitation. Sparta couldn't afford men divided between affection and duty. So they built a system to ensure they would never have to choose. But the machine went further. If a marriage produced no children, or worse, weak ones, the state intervened again. It might instruct a proven warrior to impregnate another man's wife, or allow a respected woman to conceive with someone other than her husband. Not in secret, but openly, with permission. No shame, no jealousy, just breeding, as deliberate as horse selection. The idea was simple. Strong men and strong women should reproduce, regardless of vows. Family was a means, not an end. The result was a society where paternity blurred, fidelity meant nothing, and every child belonged not to a father or a mother, but to the state. Even emotion became property of the government. Spartan women lived within this paradox, worshipped as vital, yet stripped of their humanity. Modern admirers often call them early feminists, educated, athletic, property owners. And in a narrow sense, it's true. They read, they trained, they commanded estates. While Athenian women lived in seclusion, Spartan women could speak in public, even criticize men. But freedom in Sparta was never a gift. It was a calculation. Healthy women bore healthy children. Fit mothers meant fit soldiers. Their independence wasn't empowerment. It was eugenics, dressed in respect. They trained their bodies not for vanity, but for the womb. They were fed well, allowed to exercise, taught to harden their hearts, because tenderness was inefficient. They learned to value their sons not for who they were, but for how well they died. Spartan mothers became the architects of cruelty, whispering to their children before battle, "Come back with your shield or on it." In that phrase, there is no comfort, only command. One story tells of a Spartan mother who killed her son after he returned alive from battle, having fled his post. Whether that tale is myth or truth doesn't matter. What matters is that the Spartans told it with pride. The system worked because the people believed in it. The mothers taught their sons to fear dishonor more than death. The fathers taught them that compassion was weakness. And the city taught them that individuality was treason. By the time the next generation was born, Sparta had perfected its cruel genius, a machine that replaced love with loyalty, family with function, and life itself with a single purpose, the making of soldiers. But this was only the beginning. The newborn's first test wasn't childbirth, it was survival. And for those deemed unfit, the city had prepared a place of judgment. The baby cries, a sound so small, so fragile, and yet, in Sparta, that first cry is not a beginning. It is a test. The mother, exhausted from labor, reaches for her child. But before she can touch it, the midwife steps back, clutching the infant close, and walks out. The mother is left alone, her heart suspended between hope and dread. She knows where they are taking her child, to the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. Old men hardened by war, men who have seen blood spilt on every field from Arcadia to Thermopylae. Their eyes are trained not for compassion, but for flaw. They strip the infant naked. The room is silent except for the hiss of oil lamps. One elder turns the child over, inspecting the legs, the spine, the shape of the skull. Another pinches the flesh, testing its firmness. They listen to the cry. Is it strong or feeble? They are not healers. They are judges of worth. If the baby's limbs are crooked, if its skin too pale, if the cry too soft, the verdict is simple: unfit. And then, without ceremony, the child is taken away to a rocky chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetus, a place called the Apothetai, the deposits. There, the weak are left exposed to the elements. No burial, no farewell. Just silence, wind, and the cry that fades into the night. To modern ears, it sounds monstrous. To Sparta, it was logic. The city was a fortress surrounded by enemies, the enslaved Helots who farmed their land and outnumbered them 10-1. To survive, every Spartan had to be a pillar of strength. Weakness wasn't just failure, it was danger, a crack in the wall that could bring the whole city down. So, they removed weakness before it could grow. Infanticide wasn't cruelty, it was maintenance, the brutal arithmetic of a society at war with the world. But those who survived the inspection weren't spared from cruelty. They had only earned the right to endure it. For the first 7 years of life, a Spartan boy lived at home, though home is a generous word. Fathers were absent, living in communal barracks even after marriage. Mothers, hardened by ideology, were trained to suppress tenderness. No lullabies, no indulgence, only iron discipline. Then, at age 7, came the Ago, Sparta's most infamous institution, a word that meant upbringing but translated more accurately to conditioning. One morning, soldiers arrived at every household. The mothers handed over their sons without protest. Some even smiled through their tears, proud to prove their devotion to the state. The children were marched away, barefoot, into a world designed to unmake them. The barracks became their new home. They slept on beds of reeds cut by their own hands from the riverbank. They were given a single thin tunic, one garment for all seasons. No shoes, no blankets, no comfort. Food was scarce by design. Hunger was policy. A hungry child learns to think. A starving one learns to steal. The instructors taught them to steal, not for rebellion, but for skill. To move unseen, to plan, to adapt. The lesson wasn't about morality, it was about survival. If you were caught, you weren't punished for stealing. You were beaten for failing. Because in Sparta, failure was the only crime. The beatings were savage. Whips cut into flesh. Bruises blossomed like purple flowers across their backs. But tears were forbidden. Pain was a teacher. Compassion was the enemy. There is a story, perhaps true, perhaps legend, of a boy who stole a fox to eat. When questioned, he hid it under his cloak. The animal began to claw and bite at his stomach, tearing into him. Yet the boy stood silent, blood soaking through his tunic, his face calm. When he finally collapsed, the fox still gnawing at his entrails, he was dead. But he had not been caught. The instructors told his story with pride, not pity. This was the ideal Spartan child, dying without sound, suffering without shame. But the Ago wasn't only about the body. It was about language, obedience, and psychological control. Instructors peppered the boys with questions, riddles, traps disguised as lessons. Who is the bravest man in Sparta? What is the highest virtue? Is it better to steal and succeed, or to obey and fail? There were no right answers, only tests. A single hesitation could earn a bite on the thumb or a blow across the face. The goal was precision, to make words weapons and silence armor. From this training came the term laconic, meaning concise, born from Laconia, Sparta's homeland. Every unnecessary word was weakness, every emotion vulnerability. The perfect Spartan spoke like a sword, sharp, short, final. But the cruelty didn't come only from above. It came from within. Older boys, called the Irenes, ruled over the younger like drill sergeants or predators. They could strike, mock, starve, or humiliate their subordinates at will. This hierarchy wasn't abuse, it was the system, teaching domination, submission, and control. Boys learned to fear not their enemies, but each other. Friendship, empathy, affection, all became liabilities. Every gesture could be betrayal. Every word could be a trap. The Ago produced boys who were socially sharp, but emotionally hollow. They could read the smallest twitch in a rival's face, but couldn't recognize kindness. They learned to compete, not to connect. To endure, not to feel. By the time they reached adolescence, these boys had been stripped of everything soft and human. They had become instruments, sleek, efficient, and utterly obedient. And yet, Sparta still demanded more. Even after pain, hunger, and fear had been mastered, there remained one final test, a ritual so savage that even other Greeks found it horrifying. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, the goddess of wilderness and survival, the boys faced their graduation. Cheese was placed upon the altar, a symbol of reward. To claim it, they had to run through a gauntlet of older boys armed with whips. Every strike drew blood. The objective wasn't to dodge or to win. It was to endure, without flinching, without crying out. Plutarch wrote that some boys died smiling under the lash. To Sparta, that smile was victory. To the rest of the world, it was madness. By the time they emerged from the Ago, these boys were no longer children. They were weapons. Bodies hardened, emotions cauterized, instincts sharpened to a single point: obedience. But Sparta wasn't done with them yet. The next test wouldn't happen in the barracks. It would happen in the shadows, where morality would vanish entirely, and where the state would teach them to kill, not for glory, but for control. Night falls over the Spartan countryside. The mountains of Tagetes rise like dark teeth against the stars. Somewhere beyond the olive groves, a figure moves, barefoot, silent, carrying nothing but a dagger. He is 17. He has survived hunger, whippings, and years of discipline. He has spoken little, smiled less, and never cried. Tonight, he will kill for the first time. This is not war. This is the Crypteia, the hidden schooling of murder. Every year, the most promising graduates of the Agoge were chosen for this secret task, a shadow army within the Spartan army. They were not soldiers. They were predators. Their mission to roam the countryside, alone and unseen, hunting the enslaved population, the Helots, who outnumbered Spartans 10-1. The Helots were the invisible foundation of Sparta's greatness. Conquered Greeks who farmed the land, produced the food, and built the wealth that allowed the citizens to train for war. They were indispensable, and they were despised. Every Spartan boy grew up knowing that without Helots, Sparta would starve, but with them, Sparta might fall. Because the Helots remembered their freedom, and they hated their masters with quiet, enduring fury. The ruling class lived in constant fear of revolt, so they turned fear into policy, control into ritual, terror into education. The Ephors, Sparta's 5 highest magistrates, performed a grotesque ceremony each year. Upon taking office, they declared war on the Helots. It was not a metaphor, it was a legal act. From that moment on, every Helot in Laconia was not a slave, but an enemy combatant. Killing one was no longer murder, it was warfare, sanctioned by law. The Crypteia were the weapon of that law. Each initiate was sent into the wilderness with only a knife and minimal rations. They hid by day, moved by night. Their orders were precise. Kill any Helot who appeared too strong, too proud, too intelligent. A Helot who stood taller than others. A Helot who spoke too confidently. A Helot whom others might follow. They called it cutting down the tall poppies. Eliminate potential leaders before they could rise. Keep the field level and silent. The mission was not about survival or heroism. It was about obedience. Could you kill a man who had done nothing to you? Could you murder an unarmed farmer in the dark, not out of hatred, but out of discipline? Could you watch him die, wipe your blade, and feel nothing? If you could, you were ready. You had mastered not just your body, but your soul. You had proven that the state owned even your conscience. The Helots knew of the Crypteia. They could never predict when it would come, but they lived in its shadow, a nightmare that walked on 2 legs. At harvest time, the fields grew heavy with grain and fear. No helot knew if he would see the morning. Families hid their strongest sons, their proudest brothers, knowing that pride itself was a death sentence. Imagine the silence of that terror. The soft knock in the night. The sound of movement in the grass. Then, nothing. This was how Sparta ruled, not by number, not by wealth, but by psychological domination. Every helot learned from childhood that resistance was suicide. Every Spartan learned that compassion was treason. The Crypteia didn't just protect Sparta, it infected it. It created generations of men who associated virtue with violence and control with killing. It trained them to see fear not as horror, but as harmony. A natural order where the strong purged the weak. When the young assassins returned from their months in the wild, they were welcomed without ceremony. No medals, no songs, just quiet acknowledgement. A nod, a place at the communal meal, and the understanding that they had crossed the final threshold. They were now Spartiates, full citizens, equals in name only, bonded by blood and silence. They had learned what it meant to live without mercy. And Sparta, in turn, had learned that a man who can kill without hatred will obey without question. By the age of 30, these men were finally allowed to live outside the barracks, to marry, to eat at home. Yet, even then, their lives were not their own. Marriage was no refuge, no sanctuary from the system. It was merely the next step in the cycle, the machinery of breeding turning once again. Their wives had been trained since childhood to be perfect vessels, strong, stoic, devoted. Women who had learned that their worth was measured by the sons they produced and the courage with which they sent them to die. In Sparta, even love was state property. When a son was born, a mother didn't whisper lullabies, she whispered commands. When a husband left for war, a wife didn't weep. She handed him his shield and said the words that have outlived the empire that forged them. Come back with your shield, or on it. And if he didn't return, she would not mourn. Because in Sparta, death was not tragedy. Weakness was. This cycle of breeding, selection, indoctrination, and death turned for 3 centuries. Sparta became a living paradox, a city that conquered all, but could not save itself. For every victory, it lost a piece of its humanity. For every child it forged into a weapon, it buried a soul. But the cracks were forming. Even perfection, it turned out, could rot. By 30, a Spartan man had survived everything the state could throw at him: hunger, pain, solitude, blood. He had stolen and not been caught. He had endured the lash and not cried out. He had killed without hesitation and without remorse. Now, at last, he was a man, a homonoios, an equal. Equal not in comfort, but in duty. He could finally live with his wife. He could own a home. He could vote in the assembly and dine at the Syssitia, the communal mess hall that defined Spartan citizenship. Yet even here, in this narrow privilege, there was no peace. Sparta did not permit peace. A Spartan's life remained the property of the state until death. Every meal was the same: black broth, made from pig's blood and vinegar. Simple, foul-tasting, but symbolic. Luxury was corruption. Pleasure was weakness. Even in victory, they lived like soldiers on campaign, because comfort dulled the edge of discipline. And discipline was all they had. They trained daily, long after other Greeks would have retired to philosophy or trade. They drilled with spear and shield, perfecting formations that had not changed in centuries. They maintained the same barracks bonds that had defined their youth. eating, sleeping, and fighting beside the same men until death. Their wives managed estates. Their slaves tilled the fields. Their children were prepared to replace them. Sparta was a closed loop, a machine with no off switch. But the machine had a flaw, a quiet, mathematical flaw that no ritual could erase: numbers. Each Spartan warrior represented 3 decades of investment, selected before birth, tested at birth, trained through the Agoge, hardened through war. Every dead Spartan was not just a life lost, but a generation erased. And they were dying faster than they could replace themselves. The irony was cruel. Sparta had created soldiers who were nearly unbeatable, and therefore always used. War was their purpose, their justification, their religion. But war devours its devotees. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans became immortal in story and extinct in bloodline. Each one had been forged through years of labor, love denied, emotions suppressed. Each one could have fathered children. None did. Glory, it turned out, was sterilization. The decline began quietly. In the 6th century BCE, there were perhaps 8,000 full Spartan citizens, men who had completed the Agoge and eaten at the communal tables. By the 4th century, that number had fallen below 1,000. And when they died, the city shrank not just in body, but in spirit. As their population dwindled, their paranoia deepened. They tightened control over the helots, expanded the crypteia, and clung harder to the rituals that had once made them strong. But strength had become obsession, and obsession, in time, became decay. Even their victories betrayed them. In 404 BCE, after nearly 30 years of brutal conflict, Sparta defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian War. For the first time, they stood unchallenged, the supreme power of Greece. But triumph poisoned them. Wealth flowed into the city: gold from Persia, tribute from conquered states, spoils from the fallen empire of Athens. For centuries, Sparta had outlawed money, believing that precious metals corroded the soul. Lycurgus, the mythical lawgiver, had decreed that Spartans could use only iron bars for trade, heavy, worthless, and inconvenient. Now, suddenly, the city swam in silver. The result was predictable. Some Spartans embraced wealth. Others clung to austerity. The unity that had made them strong, the equality of suffering, shattered. Land could now be bought and sold. And as wealth concentrated, so did power. A few families grew rich, the rest fell into poverty. The communal meals that defined citizenship required financial contributions, and when poorer men could no longer afford them, they were stripped of their status. The homomoioi, the equals, were no longer equal. The city that had once prided itself on uniformity now fractured along invisible lines of privilege. Luxury crept into homes. Gold replaced discipline. And the warriors who had been taught to despise comfort began to taste it and crave it. Sparta had built its strength on denial. Once that denial vanished, so did the foundation. But something deeper was breaking. Something even the most disciplined soldiers couldn't fight: the loss of belief. For centuries, Spartans had endured the unendurable because they believed their system made them invincible. They believed every whipping, every death, every sacrifice served a greater order, the eternal might of Sparta. But as they watched their population shrink and their morals rot, that faith faltered. The rituals that once inspired awe now seemed empty. The Agoge, once a forge of heroes, now produced automatons for a war machine that no longer had wars worth fighting. Men trained to die for the state now hesitated, not out of cowardice, but confusion. What was left to die for when the city itself had forgotten why it lived? And then came the day Spartan learned that perfection cannot adapt. The year was 371 BCE. The place, a plain called Leuctra. Their enemy, the city of Thebes. The Spartan king, Cleombrotus, led an army of their finest, veterans of 100 battles, men who believed they were the peak of human evolution. Across the field stood a general named Epaminondas, a thinker in armor, a man who studied not tradition, but possibility. He did something no one had dared to do before. He changed the formation. Instead of matching the Spartan phalanx line for line, he concentrated his forces, 50 men deep on one side, a wall of momentum aimed straight at the Spartan right flank, where their king and best warriors stood. It was madness by conventional standards, but it was new, and new was something Sparta could not comprehend. When the Theban columns slammed into their line, the Spartans did not adapt. They could not. They had been trained to obey, not to improvise. They fought bravely, perfectly, and they died perfectly. 400 of them fell, including their king. For any other city, it would have been a defeat. For Sparta, it was an extinction event. Their myth shattered that day. The invincible warriors had been beaten not by strength, but by imagination. Sparta's power bled away like water from a cracked vessel. Its allies revolted. Its slaves rebelled. Its numbers dwindled further. Within a generation, the once feared city became a curiosity, a relic of a time when perfection seemed possible. But perfection is sterile. It creates no art, no innovation, no future. It can only repeat itself until it dies. The plain of Leuctra was more than a battlefield. It was the place where an idea died. For centuries, Sparta had seemed eternal, a city without softness, a people without fear. Its warriors had been the living proof that discipline could conquer destiny. But when the phalanx broke that day in 371 BCE, something deeper shattered than a line of shields. The myth collapsed. For generations, the Spartan had believed that his training made him invincible, that suffering was strength, that obedience was purity. But on that field, obedience met imagination, and imagination won. The perfect machine had encountered something it could not compute: creativity. 400 citizens fell that afternoon, 400 men who could never be replaced. For a city that counted fewer than 1,500 full citizens, it was a death sentence. And as their bodies cooled beneath the Greek sun, the idea of Sparta, the dream of human perfection through control, began to rot. In the years that followed, Sparta tried to pretend nothing had changed. They rebuilt their army, retrained their youth, performed the same rituals. The Agoge continued. The lash still struck the altar at Artemis Orthia. The speeches still preached endurance, sacrifice, and honor. But the spark was gone. The system was going through the motions, repeating its rhythms like an echo with no source. Outside their borders, the world moved on. New cities rose: the Thebans, the Macedonians, and then the Romans. All learned from Sparta's discipline, but never copied its rigidity. They built systems that could bend, adapt, evolve. Sparta could not. The city's greatest virtue had become its fatal flaw. In their obsession with purity, they had eliminated flexibility. In their worship of obedience, they had extinguished imagination. And then came the greatest humiliation of all: tourism. By the 2nd century BCE, Sparta no longer ruled anyone. Its soldiers no longer terrified the world, they entertained it. Roman travelers, curious about the ancient tales, came to see the famous rituals: the whippings, the endurance tests, the mock ceremonies once designed to forge warriors. They paid to watch boys bleed at the altar of Artemis Orthia, just as they might pay to see a gladiator fight in Rome. The pain was real, but the meaning was gone. What had once been sacred was now performance, cruelty preserved for spectacle. Imagine it. A Roman nobleman lounging in silk, sipping wine, while a Spartan boy, descendant of Leonidas, stands beneath the lash and smiles through blood. The crowd applauds. History weeps. Even the Spartan elite, those few families who still claimed the title of homooi, had lost the thread. They spoke of honor and austerity while living in imported marble villas, their tables heavy with foreign luxuries. They quoted the laws of Lycurgus even as they broke them. Their women no longer produced soldiers. Their sons no longer trained in the Agoge. They had bred themselves into extinction. By the time Rome conquered Greece, Sparta was a shadow, a monument to its own myth. The once feared warriors were now curiosities, their city a museum of discipline gone mad. The Roman historian Plutarch visited centuries later and described the rituals as relics, fragments of a vanished soul. The machine had eaten itself. But even as its stones crumbled, the idea of Sparta refused to die. There is something intoxicating about perfection, about the fantasy of control, the dream that weakness can be eliminated, that a society can be purified through discipline. That dream survived long after the Spartans were dust. It survived in the admiration of philosophers who saw beauty in order. It survived in military academies that studied Spartan tactics and borrowed their symbols: the lambda, the red cloak, the iron will. It even survived in tyrannies that came centuries later, in leaders who believed humanity could be engineered, shaped, purified. Each time, the dream returned, and each time, it devoured those who dreamed it. Because perfection is a trap. It promises strength, but demands everything that makes strength worth having. It offers unity, but erases individuality. It replaces love with loyalty, compassion with calculation, and culture with conformity. The Spartans achieved perfection for a moment. They built bodies without fear, soldiers without mercy, citizens without doubt. And when the wars ended, when the enemies were gone, they discovered the truth. There was nothing left inside. They had conquered the world around them, but not themselves. By the Roman era, Sparta was no longer a threat. It was a tourist attraction. Foreigners came to see the last of the Spartans, like visitors to a zoo. They marveled at the whippings, the dances, the rituals, and told themselves they were witnessing ancient strength. But what they were really seeing was the ghost of discipline, the echo of a system that had destroyed its own humanity to survive. The once proud warriors who had held Thermopylae were now actors in their own tragedy, performing for applause. Their shields hung on walls, their swords rusted. The red cloaks were costumes. Centuries later, when Europe rediscovered the classics, Sparta rose again, this time as myth, stripped of its cruelty. Pain became glory. Oppression became order. The world remembered their courage, but forgot their corpses. The story of the 300 became legend, divorced from the dark machinery that made them possible. Even today, the name Spartan means strength, simplicity, endurance. But few remember what those words cost. Few remember that for every hero raised in the Agoge, countless infants never left the apothete. Few remember that the foundation of their empire was a pile of bones, of children, of slaves, of souls. And yet, in those ruins, there is a lesson. A whisper that cuts through time, sharper than any spear. If you seek to perfect humanity, you must first destroy it. History remembers Sparta with a kind of uneasy awe. Awe at the discipline, the courage, the stoic grandeur. Unease at the cost. For 3 centuries, the Spartans built what no other society dared attempt: a civilization founded on the deliberate rejection of humanity. Every emotion, every instinct, every attachment that made people unpredictable was stripped away. What remained were instruments, precise, loyal, and lethal. And for a time, it worked. They conquered neighbors, they crushed rebellions. Their warriors were legend. Their enemies trembled. But the secret of Sparta's fall isn't just that their system collapsed. It's that their system worked too well, until it had no purpose left. They created men who could endure anything except peace. Men who could fight every enemy except themselves. When the wars ended, they were left with nothing but silence. And silence is the one thing a weapon cannot survive. When Sparta finally faded from history, it left behind more than ruins. It left behind an idea, the myth of human perfection through control. That idea, like a virus, never died. It slept. Centuries later, it resurfaced, in different lands, under different names. Each time, it began the same way, with fear. Fear of weakness, fear of chaos, fear that humanity left to itself was flawed, undisciplined, impure. The tools changed, but the dream remained. Eugenics, social engineering, utopian planning. The belief that society could be fixed by deciding who deserved to live, who should reproduce, who should vanish. In Sparta, it began with babies inspected for strength. In the 20th century, it would reappear in laboratories and concentration camps, in nations that believed they could sculpt the perfect race. Different language, same logic. The same ancient delusion, that weakness can be eliminated without eliminating compassion. The Spartans never called it evil. They called it necessary. They believed they were saving their city, preserving purity, defending order. So did those who came after them. That's what makes Sparta's story so chilling. It isn't just a tale of ancient cruelty. It's a mirror, showing us how easily civilization can rationalize horror when dressed in the language of discipline and virtue. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once admired the Spartans, their clarity, their ruthlessness, their willingness to embrace struggle. Later, totalitarian regimes would take that admiration further. They saw in Sparta a prototype, a model for breeding strength, suppressing individuality, and forging unity through fear. They quoted its laws, they studied its systems. They built modern versions of the Agoge. The cycle had begun again. But there is a deeper paradox in Sparta's legacy, one that reveals the fatal flaw in every dream of perfection. To eliminate weakness, you must first decide what weakness is. To enforce purity, you must first become its judge. And in doing so, you replace compassion with control, empathy with hierarchy, life with system. Perfection is not balance. It is erasure. The Spartans erased softness, and with it, love. They erased individuality, and with it, creativity. They erased emotion, and with it, art, curiosity, tenderness, invention. The very things that allow humanity to endure change. And when change came, they shattered. Their story is not just about soldiers or war. It's about what happens when fear of imperfection becomes policy. It's about how the pursuit of strength can become the worship of cruelty. How the rejection of weakness can become the rejection of life itself. Because what is weakness, really? The tear of a mother losing her child? The tremble in a voice that speaks the truth? The hesitation to kill when you could? These are not flaws. They are the roots of civilization. The Spartans saw compassion as contamination. But compassion is what makes humanity adaptive, what allows us to survive not by eliminating the weak, but by protecting them. That is how societies grow, evolve, endure. not through fear, but through connection. Not through breeding programs or laws carved in stone, but through the quiet, stubborn belief that life in all its imperfection is worth preserving. Sparta's ruins still stand. Stone walls, broken columns, fragments of temples. Tourists walk through them, photographing the remains of a civilization that once tried to transcend human nature and failed. And if you stand there long enough, in the wind that moves through the olive trees, you might hear it, the faint echo of iron against stone, the memory of voices that swore they were building a paradise of strength, only to find they had built a prison with no walls, a system with no exit, a perfection that could not survive its own success. The ruins of Sparta lie silent now. No banners, no drums, no sound of marching feet. Just the whisper of wind across the stones. The same wind that once carried the cries of newborns to the mountains. The clash of shields in the valleys. The chants of boys at the altar of Artemis Orthia. For centuries, travelers have walked these ruins searching for the secret of Spartan greatness. They stand where Leonidas once stood, where kings and warriors swore eternal loyalty to their city. They come expecting inspiration, and they find something colder. They find absence. No art, no literature, no philosophy, no monuments of beauty or compassion. Only the architecture of control, efficient, unyielding, and dead. The Athenians built statues, theaters, ideas. The Spartans built silence. And silence, unlike marble, cannot survive time. For 300 years, Sparta seemed immortal. But immortality is not measured in power. It is measured in legacy. Athens burned, yet its ideas survived. Democracy, philosophy, theater, architecture, the belief that thought itself could be sacred. Sparta never burned, it simply vanished. Because when it died, there was nothing left worth remembering but fear. Their experiment to perfect humanity through control did not end with them. It never truly ends. It waits, it whispers, it takes new forms. Governments that prize obedience over empathy. Corporations that measure worth in efficiency. Cultures that celebrate strength while mocking vulnerability. Each time, the same illusion returns. If we could just remove what's weak, what's soft, what's unpredictable, then everything would work. But remove those things, and what remains is not strength. It's machinery. Sparta's legacy is not a blueprint for greatness. It is a warning, carved into history by the cost of its own success. A warning that fear of weakness can destroy a civilization faster than any enemy. A warning that discipline without compassion becomes cruelty. That loyalty without conscience becomes tyranny. That strength without love becomes meaningless. Because strength alone does not build. It only endures. Until there is nothing left to endure for. When we look at the story of Sparta, we see more than an ancient city. We see the mirror of every society that ever tried to trade freedom for order, humanity for perfection, individuality for control. We see the reflection of our own temptations, the urge to simplify what is complex, to fix what is human, to create a world without pain, without chaos, without flaw. But chaos is where creation lives. Flaws are where empathy begins. And pain, the kind that teaches, not destroys, is what makes us reach for one another. Sparta forgot that. And in doing so, it forgot itself. There is a kind of perfection that kills everything it touches. a perfection of symmetry, of silence, of control. The Spartans reached it, and it destroyed them. The lesson they leave us is not carved on stone or written in books. It lives in the simple truth that imperfection is not our failure. It is our salvation. Humanity's strength lies not in eliminating weakness, but in embracing it. Because the child who cries, the mother who weeps, the soldier who hesitates, the thinker who questions, these are the cracks through which light enters history. And that light is the one thing Sparta could never manufacture. It can only be lived. In the end, Sparta didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it was perfect.